real radical nature of the conversation is not for us to get curious about how we're going to reform our systems, but to get really curious about how we're going to help nourish and help flourish the community alternatives that allow people to live lives of their own choosing with other people, using the strengths they have within them and around them, including their ecology and maybe even the supportive functions of some of our institutions, but in ways we really would be surprised by. So I think starting the conversation more from the perspective of community alternatives to institutionalization might be more useful than having conversations about how we can reform our systems and how ABCD can help us do that. So this is very much about leading by stepping back. It's about handing power away. It's about maybe even entertaining that we might need to hang a do not resuscitate sign around our neck if we're not being useful. So it's challenging stuff. And therefore words like catalyst are absolutely useless to describe what we're talking about, because the scientific definition of catalyst suggests that it's something that acts on other things but doesn't change itself. And the fundamental nature of an asset-based way of thinking is that actually we're all changing. If we're, as the American expression is, if we get some skin in the game, fundamentally this is about getting better at being human together. So Harry's thinking over the last couple of weeks has been very much top of mind. Another woman that I met while I was in the States is famed for many things. Judith Snow is her name. But the thing she's probably best known for is the fact that she was the first person in Ontario to secure money instead of service. I think this is fascinating. So in 1988, she secured 120,000 Canadian dollars to essentially purchase what she considered to be her good life. And 3 years after she received this budget, John McKnight, who's the framer of a lot of this thinking, asked her, he said, you are the empirical proof, you're the living empirical evidence that somebody can live a life outside of a service, because Judith Snow, after a few months of birth, lost all physicality except the capacity to hear, speak, and see, but her whole body essentially lost movement. If she was here, she'd say, I can't move anything, but I feel everything. And she's coming on 65 years of age. In fact, she was 65 just a couple of weeks ago. But she was talking to me about this whole question of primary care. And of course, now she has the resource, she has the money to purchase her own support workers and her own services. And it's fascinating, when John asked her the question 3 years on after she secured her budget, so how many services do you purchase by comparison with the services that you were presented with, that you were gifted while you were in institutional life? And she said, hardly any. Hardly any. And we see this time and time again when people are given power and control to dictate what their good life looks like. Actually, what they surround themselves has very little to do with the services that we think they have a God-given right to, or whatever you believe in or don't believe in. So there's a big issue here, I think, about the assumption that life is about services. That if we can figure out some way of being more interagency, wraparound, integrated, coordinated in how we ensure that we narrow the gap between vulnerable people and our services, that life will be just dandy. And the reality of the situation for people who care and for people who matter is that actually isn't the game changer. So why I'm really curious about an asset-based way of thinking, which is not a model, it's a perspective, it's a lifestyle choice, is because I think it gives us a route into thinking about how we can do something serious about reseeding associational life. In a world that says, let's focus on the marketplace, let's grow our businesses, let's figure out the solution vis-a-vis systems reform, this radical idea that we should start from a different place. Instead of being systems reformers, it's inviting us to be, in a sense, disruptive innovators. instead of trying to figure out where's the Trojan horse that we can roll into the inner citadel of the system. It's inviting us to be Trojan mice, and actually it's inviting us to go somewhere very, very different. So with that as kind of a context or scene setter, my role is I'm a faculty member of the ABCD Institute, which is based out of Northwestern University in Chicago. And particularly, I have a role in leading some thinking, I guess, around ABCD and trying to just convene people into conversations and follow where the energy takes me and where the energy is greatest, really. And I have to say, the energy around asset-based community development in the UK is really, it's phenomenal. I think the Netherlands would be the next place where I'm seeing a real movement for change in Europe. So it's in that context that I'm going to share what I share, a little bit from the States, but most primarily from the UK and our work in the UK. And I will very, very generously introduce some of the work and mention Gloucestershire. So just making a note of where we're currently, I suppose, thinking about and learning about how asset-based community development can really come alive in a citizen-led way, not in an institutional way. And I'm not actually particularly interested in co-production either. I want to get beyond co-production. There are some real concerns about co-production, particularly in this country. But I'm really interested in learning how citizens, I'm sorry if that upsets people, but I think I'm going to upset people a little bit today as well. So, I'm really interested in how citizens are leading their own change together. So we're thinking about that in a number of different ways. One of the ways we're thinking about that is actually going into places. So currently we're in Gloucestershire. We just started yesterday in the Wirral, in Kirklees, in Leeds, in Torbay, in Croydon, in Derby, in Thurrock, and starting at several other sites in Scotland, to really go in at neighbourhood level by invitation and to be with community folk to figure out how they can actually look at what they have and put it together in a way that makes sense to them. So, hopefully that'll seed some of the conversation. Because I think about 3 years ago, people were saying, ABCD, that's an American idea, never work around here. And then, as you start to plod along and you find some traction and some purchase in a couple of places in the UK, people say, yeah, well, it might work there, but it would never work here. So it's important, I think, to hear that in a way and not to tease it overly. Because in a sense, I think what people are saying is we need to find a way of respecting the core for sure, but innovating around the edge and making sure it makes sense to us locally. Because everything in a local context is owned by local people. So let me just talk to you a little bit about the background, or the heritage, if you like, of asset-based community development. It's slightly untrue to say it started in 1995. In fact, it's profoundly untrue to say it started in 1995. John McKnight, who's 83 years young this year, really, I think, started framing asset-based community development in the 60s as an Alinsky organizer when he trained under Saul Alinsky, and began to realize the limits of community organizing. And you can, recognize, I guess, that you can only rub the sores of discontent for so long. And actually, one of the flaws of community organizing is that when you succeed, people have nothing more to organize around. So at the same time, he was really becoming very friendly with Ivan Illich, so was collaborating with him and learning from him. Around the time he was writing Deschooling Society and Medical Nemesis and all such things. That's why he smiles sometimes. You hear the radical ideas that are emerging at the moment, and go back and read Illich and say, it's not all that new, or Schumacher. It's been around a long time, which kind of proves the point that this is not about systems reform, it's about something else. But I think what happened was John really began to think about the thinking of Alinsky and Illich and other people, and began to also reflect on his own practice as a community builder, as a community organizer, and recognized that there were some profound limits in the way we did business. But over the years, he also became more interested in other things, and ultimately he found his way into academic life. So in 1969, he was invited to be part of a team, an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary team of academics who worked at Northwestern to think about how things at urban level could be more sustaining, could be healthier, could be more powerfully better led by citizens. And at that stage he began to realize he needed to think of something that wasn't just focused on deficits. He needed to think about something that really drew together the power of community. He would say, if he was here, I think, that he spent most of these early years in university being offended by other academics. Because largely at that time in North America, the primary focus of academic institutions was on the deficits and the problems and the maladies of the neighborhoods that they studied. That was largely where research funding was driving the agenda. And it wasn't, of course, peculiar just to academics. Pretty much any institutional person who had anything to do with community was trying to solve problems. That was the nature of the business. So in the late 80s, John and Jody, Professor Jody Kretzmann, the chap just here, and about 18 other people who were really passionate about the idea that communities shouldn't be seen as backwaters of pathology, but should be seen in terms of their resources, their capacities, the things they could use to make a difference. But recognizing obviously that the current paradigm was the opposite, they decided to try to do some research on that. So they spent about 4 years traveling across North America into some 300 neighborhoods in 20 cities. And essentially what they were trying to understand is what they kind of knew already. But what empirical evidence exists that shows us or teaches us as outsiders what people indigenously use to make things better? Because the prevailing assumption was that what people were using was outside resource. And so when they spent that 4-year period, largely what they did was they invited people to tell stories. You all know this, I'm sure, that there are 2 ways of knowing things generally. One is through studies, the other is through stories. Studies give us more data. I think stories are what inspire change. So if we're in the business of trying to empower people and include people and really understand from people's perspective what matters, then stories are a tremendous vehicle, an inclusive vehicle through which we can really learn ourselves as outsiders, ignorant of the local context, waiting to be educated. It really fascinates me how so many outsiders come in and evaluate people instead of saying, I am the most profoundly ignorant person here, educate me, I sit at your feet. So John and Jody tried to redress that imbalance and invited people to tell them stories about how they came together to make things better. And of course, they gathered thousands and thousands of stories, some 3,000 stories of people talking about how they actually use their capacity, they use their resource to make a difference. And what I thought would be really helpful to do is just share with you what they discovered through listening to people really, were the 6 building blocks of community building or community development, or whatever turn of phrase feels right to you. I think it's important to say here that that was the late 80s and it was North American, so I don't want to be culturally imperial. So it's peculiar to that time, to that culture. But what's exciting to us now is we've asked the same questions over and over again in many, many different countries, and the answers seem very, very consistent. So this seems trans-global, trans-historical, and trans-cultural. And there isn't an awful lot that you could say is all of those things. So the first building block of a powerful community is people. No surprise, but that's not a fully accurate description. It's people who are defining themselves. This must be spring-loaded. It's people who are defining themselves in terms of what they contribute, rather than what they receive. So people who perceive themselves in terms of the gifts that they can offer to the community. Gifts of the head, things they know, gifts of the heart, things they're passionate about, and gifts of the hands, things they can make and do. And there's nobody on the planet who doesn't have some or all of those. So that's the key, that's the building block. If we were saying that community was like a cake, that would be the flour in the cake. It's the critical ingredient. And it's really, really important, I think, to say that in every single story that John and Jody collected, and every story since then, What we hear is not people who describe themselves necessarily as volunteers or as leaders fitting this. In fact, often they're not leaders or volunteers at all. I think what they're practicing is the art of connectorship. It's often said that a gift is not a gift until it's given. The gift is not a gift until it's received either. So there are people who have the capacity both to know they have a gift to give, but also a capacity to create the conditions to ensure the gift is received in a way that doesn't make the person receiving the gift feel diminished. So somehow they've learned the art of focusing on what's strong instead of what's wrong, so they can use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong stronger. And you don't go to college to figure that stuff out. It's visceral, it's intuitive, it's them. They came made that way. Nobody educated them. In fact, the only thing that ever got in the way of them knowing that and learning that was education. So this is fundamental to who they are. So in every story of communities getting stronger, you will find people who kind of fit that bill. But the difficulty is, if that's all you have in a community is many, many hundreds of individual people contributing their gifts, all you have is lots and lots of social innovation, lots and lots of social enterprise. But I think community innovation is different. Community innovation is about total place connection. It's about democracy, so it goes beyond individual change. That's one of the problems with where co-production is getting stuck in this country. The second problem is that it's being led by professionals as opposed to being led by citizens. And the third problem is the citizen is being seen as a client instead of a citizen. But in this instance, the channel that individual social innovators use in community to multiply and amplify their individual gifts is associational life. It's clubs, it's groups, it's below the radar, clubbing together, people coming. It's really interesting. And one of my favorite examples of this, and you'll all be familiar with this, I'm sure, in the housing context, you'll have heard of this, is the men's shed movement. And it's fascinating to see what we've done to the men's shed movement in the UK, but before we did it, we have some examples of how institutions have come in to try to colonize the men's shed movement in Australia. Now, this, I tell you, is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to be helpful as institutions to communities. Because helping hurts and helping harms more often than we care to admit. So the story goes that, all these blokes, as they call them in Australia, kind of came up with this very radical, innovative idea of, I'm lonely with all my tools at the back of my shed. Why don't I get together with a few of my mates, stick them in one place and tell the community if their stuff needs fixing, bring it. It's as simple as that. And I guess some academics, as the story goes, got wind of it, and some public health people got wind of it and decided, hey, these men who are really hard to reach when it comes to health seem to be doing extraordinarily well by comparison with their contemporaries. And it all seems to be around social capital and these men's sheds. So they studied them, and they found a whole range of different things. One of the most interesting conclusions that they drew was that apparently a man will talk about pretty much anything if he's got a power tool in his hand. But the other thing that they concluded was that men's sheds are good for your health. And so they did what typically institutions do when they discover something happening at associational level. They tried to be helpful. They offered funding. But of course, when they offered funding, they also had to make sure that it was done just right. So they had to bring the rules and the regulations. And before very long, what you see is the kiss of death. Okay? A movement that was going up like this suddenly started to plummet. And it's a really important lesson for us to learn. What we have to try to do in associational life is nourish it, do no harm to it, and fundamentally get out of its way if we're in its way. But often when we try to help associational life, we actually hinder it. I have a 4-year-old boy who over the summer was fascinated with ladybirds, and he could never understand why the ladybird didn't survive a journey from the garden where he found the ladybird to the house to show us. And his sweaty little palms of the excitement crushed it. And I think it's a wonderful metaphor for exactly what institutions do time and time again. That's why I'm so concerned about co-production. So how do we get to a space where associational life actually flourishes and is nourished? Well, I think one of the ways we can do that is get serious about trying to organize ourselves the way people organize their lives. And so this is the third building block. And it's the building block of institutions and systems who have figured out that they need to be treasure chests for associational life, not fortress walls for vulnerable clients. So what I think is most interesting for me in terms of really radical organizations is I think what they're figuring out is how to organize themselves the way people organize their lives, instead of expecting people to organize their lives the way they've organized their services or their functions or their silos. And there's some fabulous examples. Will mentioned Jim Deere's. So Seattle, I think, is probably a really interesting example to look at in terms of how local government their current mayor is coming in and is dismantling it all. But for 20 years, I would say it held the gold standard in terms of thinking about how housing, social care, and health could come together in a way that didn't do harm to associational life. So there's hope. There are agencies, there are institutions that really understand the limits of their capacity and the harm as well as the good that they can do. So that's the third building block. Institutions that act like treasure chests instead of fortress walls, and are more curious about how they can see democracy and support the journey from client to citizen than growing their client base. And I think that's a massive challenge for a lot of organizations, particularly at a time of austerity, where there's been over 20 years of a relationship between funders and second-tier organizations that say, we will reward you for the number of clients that you have. And I suppose the fundamental challenge behind ABCD is the challenge that says, let's not grow client base, because that's growing dependency. Let's grow community, where people can actually figure out what's within them and around them and how they can use that first and foremost. And then, once they get to the limit of that, figure out what else they need for a good life. So this is fundamentally about sequencing. Really thinking about how change for people, regardless of where they're at in life, actually plays out very much on the stage of place. And getting serious about place is really important. Figuring out how, in a world, and particularly in a marketplace, where health and social care are really fundamentally disinterested in place. Because place doesn't really fit the needs of pharmacology. Place often doesn't fit the needs of organizations that are trying to grow client base. It's interesting to me that how many organizations have gone into neighborhoods over the last 20 years across Europe and tangerinized neighborhoods. That's a sociological term I just made up. Literally going in with their own interest, their own agenda, their own silo-driven question. You know, how do we reach the youth at risk? How do we reach the frail elderly? What do we do with hard-to-reach men? And they literally segment the community into units of need. And then they aggregate them together based on their pathology, and they put them in programs. Now there are words for that. Some of the softer words are segregation, but apartheid comes to mind as well. Because we now today in the UK have the most age-segregated society in the history of this country. And that's true across Europe. Young people and older people are more segregated than any other time in the history of this state. And actually, much of that segregation happened on the back of a promise of being helpful. So some of the challenge, and I wonder whether housing folk can actually be leaders in trying to address this, is we need to get to a focus which is less about segmenting community and more about working with the juice of community in a way that allows them to be the prime investors and the prime movers. And for housing, I think that means recognizing that the community is much broader than your client base, much broader than your customer base, and probably also recognizing that the people you serve are not clients or customers. They're people, they're citizens. Client comes from a Greek word which means to be on your back and powerless. Now I assume most of us didn't know that when we called people that. But now that we do, I would think it would be a good idea to think about what we really want out of the relationships we have with the people we serve. Inside every public servant is a citizen waiting to be liberated. So if we worked on this crazy notion that we are all citizens, trying to figure out how we can use our strengths to grow and deepen democracy, then we could affect and be part of a backyard revolution. It's really interesting how many professionals flee from intimacy and their own communities behind screens at their desks. I don't know how you can make this work real unless you're also at some level in your community thinking about how you future-proof your life. So often that, for 2003, because it's a beautiful day, so I was thinking about 2003 as I was walking up the street, and the heat wave of 2003. Do you remember this heat wave? 2 weeks ago, it was 2003, and 70,000 people across Europe died during that 2 weeks. And in the state that has, allegedly, after Cuba, the best healthcare system in the world, in France, more people died than anywhere else in Europe. And in Paris, 6,000 people perished. Most of them over the age of 65, women living in poor housing conditions on their own. And man, have they studied this phenomenon up the gazoo. There's been more studies on this than I've seen on anything else. And the primary conclusion is this, that actually it wasn't a systems failure. It was a community failure. That it was the absence of connectedness. That effectively, while we have a fantastic healthcare system to a point, we have a very, very disconnected community, a land of strangers. Lots of potential, but very disconnected potential. And so trying to get that connected is about working in place. It's about working at neighborhood scale, where people live their lives, where they can actually animate and mobilize and get passionate about things. And people mostly get activated around things that are close to their own doorstep. So getting down at street level, I used to call it street working, and then somebody told me personally that means something different here. So street level working, but getting down at street level and really building those relationships, that's where it's at. And what's interesting, I think, is it's very doable. If every institution that's currently tangerinizing and trying to play with a wedge so it can get its funding, actually said, let's stop doing that. Let's at least stop doing some of that and top slice a budget and create a pool and create a scenario whereby every neighborhood has the resource to employ its own community builder, to do nothing about our agendas, but essentially to do their own priorities, which primarily is around building relationships and building community. I'm absolutely certain that's the game changer. And the interesting thing is we've got all the resources right now to do it. So this is a discussion not about weathering austerity. This is a discussion about how we organize abundance. And we can do that very effectively if we shift from the money-based narrative to the gift economy. So I would suggest that we're not having a conversation about doing more with less. We're having a conversation about doing more with more. It's just that for now, I'm suggesting that the currency isn't just money. It's the place, it's the ecology, it's the gifts, it's the creativity of the economy. Imagine what would happen if everybody in this country received a basic income as opposed to welfare. What would happen to us in our jobs? I think things would fundamentally change. So one of the other building blocks, the fifth one that was identified, was the building block of economics. Not just economic exchange, but exchange of time, exchange of gifts, exchange pretty much of energy and passion. That in every neighborhood that was getting stronger, more vibrant, more prosperous, people were learning how to exchange, not necessarily to amass greater amounts of money, but actually figuring out how they could ensure that that money was circulating and was staying within the local economy. You imagine the kind of leaky bucket metaphor. They were essentially figuring out how to plug the leaks and ensure that the money was staying. So thinking about this even from a housing perspective, you guys are local businesses. Do you ensure that you buy local? Do you ensure that you invest? Where do you get your toilet roll? Do you ensure that if you can purchase toilet roll locally, that you figure out a way of supporting local people to create some indigenous business where they can produce that good? And I think these are really important questions to reflect on. Another kind of upsetting question that I'd like to throw out is this. Across the OECD, 67% of all money that's intended for the poor, anti-poverty money, never reaches poor people. It goes into the pockets of people like us, paid to provide services to poor people. 67%. We did a piece of research, the Institute, I should say, did a piece of research back in the 80s, John McKnight and a number of others led it, where they did an analysis of money spent in Cook County, which is the county in which Chicago is based. And then they looked at the number of poor people in Cook County, and they have divided the amount of money that was available for anti-poverty initiatives by the number of poor people. And do you know what they discovered? If each one of those poor people got their proportion, there would be no more poor people in Cook County. I think this asks really probing questions about what we mean by poverty and countering poverty and anti-poverty. And I think it goes to the heart of questions around power and status and stratification of society. And they're uncomfortable questions. But again, I think you guys in the housing sector, the health sector, could really lead this conversation and hold it in a way that doesn't get it politicized or get it hijacked or allow it to be hijacked. So that was the fifth. And the sixth one I wanted to mention was stories. Because I think stories are a way of beginning to allow people get some skin in the game, local people, to really state their case on their terms, in their way. But also stories inspire, I've said this already. And it's really important to recognize this, because for me, so often, we move into communities and we say, yeah, we'll support you, we'll give you the resource, but you've got to show return on investment. And the stories are the thing that we least value. But for me, I think we need to just learn how to value stories, and not alone value them, but also learn how to be part of them, and really actually form the relationship that allows us to be part of the learning cycle. So in each of the areas that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, what we're doing, we call them learning sites. What we're doing really is trying to figure out what's the emerging story, what's the current story, how do people understand how they come together and make things better, and what would need to happen for more of those stories to emerge. So that's the essence really of an asset-based way of thinking. And I guess the question that remains is, how can we support communities to identify, connect, and mobilize those 6 building blocks in a way that gives them the sense that they led the action and teaches us how to better serve them? Well, practically, there's 2 things I'll leave you with. One is we can start by doing no harm. Okay? We can really start looking at what it is we're doing and have done to colonize communities, to fragment communities, albeit in the name of being helpful. And start really thinking about, instead of just providing services, how we can begin to build community. I think our dominant paradigm is provide services to clients. What would happen if we shifted that focus a little bit and started thinking about how we could build community with fellow citizens? The second thing I think we could start doing is moving away from needs analysis. And I mean radically moving away from needs analysis. There's a lot of people at the moment saying, well, we do a lot of asset mapping. Of course, we do needs analysis as well, because it's really important. And it's just, being a good Roman Catholic at one point, I've lapsed several years now, but I remember you did the Augustinian phrase, make me chaste and not, but just not yet. That idea that actually you can go in a half-baked way and be asset-based, I just don't buy it. If you're serious about being asset-based, you start with the half-full part of the glass. You start with a focus on what people have and really, really recognizing that actually most of it is invisible to you and to the local people. This is an act of revelation. It's an act of actually supporting people to see what they haven't seen before. And go, didn't realize that was there. Because no one person can know all of the gifts and all of the assets that exist in a neighborhood unless we figure out a way of supporting them to get connected. Now, if we're continually starting our narrative with a focus on deficits and the half-empty part of the glass, the likelihood is, first of all, people would get the message that this stuff doesn't matter. It doesn't get us funding, it doesn't get us expertise, it doesn't get us any resources, so why bother? And what you don't focus on in community dissipates and atrophies. So eventually you end up with infantilized clients, totally dependent on you. Because the second thing it creates is the assumption that the only way things are going to get better around here is if somebody from outside comes in to make them better. So I suppose just to finish, I'd say that ABCD is not going to save you money. But what it will do is it will save people from you. I'm teasing. Thank you.